In an episode a few weeks ago, I showed you the state of my yarn and fiber stash. This is like all my bags of stash. It's all a big mess. Now I am cleaning up my act. Behind me here is a shelving unit I bought from Target a few weeks ago, specifically for the purpose of housing my yarn and fiber supply. In today's episode, I will walk you through the highlights of my stash. I will share with you how I'm organizing it, as well as the few guidelines I've developed to govern how I add to my stash. Because the era of me shoving my yarn into plastic bags and storing it willy-nilly all over the floor is over. Hi, I'm Melanie, and you're watching Yarn Journeys. I am an avid knitter, a spinner, and a sometime sewist, and I live in Arlington, Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C. To those of you returning to my channel, welcome back. And if you're new to watching Yarn Journeys, I am so glad you found me. So here's what's up for today's episode. So first, we're going to talk all things stash. I'm going to show you some highlights, how I'm organizing it, and along the way, the guidelines that are going to govern my stash. As always, we'll do some show and tell of finished projects and works in progress. And of course, I'll talk to you about what's coming up for the future. So, get comfy, grab a beverage, and we'll get started. So first, let's take a brief tour of this lovely new shelving unit and how I've organized my stash and fiber. Let's start with the bottom shelves. I got these delightful little boxes at the Container Store. I think they're meant for kids' rooms, but well, you know, they're cute little sheep, so why wouldn't I think they're appropriate for a yarn stash organization? So on the lower left-hand side is my fiber stash. So fiber, this is for spinning, it squishes, and you can really stuff a lot in here. I have a lot of spinning fiber. So that's the lower left-hand corner. Over here, in this one, are all the leftovers, things that are not in, not whole skeins, leftover yarn from previous projects. This is sort of my color work, fingering stash. So just so that I have it all together. For example, this is the leftovers from the plus shawl that I showed in my last episode. Lots of odds and ends, but they are useful from time to time for when you have to mend things or just need a little bit of yarn. I mean, this is probably a few hundred yards of nerd strings. Hot Damn, I think is the colorway. Superwash Merino DK. I mean, this is enough to maybe make a nice cowl or a hat. Something to play with, but definitely have no reason to get rid of it either. So, all right. Moving over here, this is yarn that I have, mostly it's yarn that I repurposed from projects that I didn't like how they came out, and I have refurbished the yarn. That is, I ripped it out and washed it and re-skeined it as I could. I also have, like, back here in the very end, I have a cone of my Jagger spun, or Jagger spun, my Jagger spun main line. So this is probably the oldest yarns in my stash. I also have the leftover Platulope from one of my Icelandic sweaters. Over here, this is all brand new skeined yarn intended for new projects. So there isn't any sort of special organization by weight, although for the most part, this is sort of worsted weight sweater kind of yarn. So I have, for example, this is the Kerry Woolen Mills Aran yarn. This is the sweater's quantity of yarn I got at Studio Donegal. Here are the as yet unwound skeins of the yarn that I'm using to make my husband's sweater. And this is some Cascade 220. That's what's going on in this square. Up here are more of what I'm calling my travel memento yarns, although that's not completely the case. So this is, for example, the yarn I got in Venice, this Poema by Lan du Nord. This is some yarn I got in Iceland at the Upspunny Mini Mill. This is the lovely alpaca boucle I got at the Fiber Art Studio on Granville Island in Vancouver. So, you know, a lot of travel yarn doesn't yet quite have a purpose. A lot of it is fingering weight sock yarn, like this guy from Mad About You on Vancouver Island. So fun stuff. And then over here, the most empty cube is my hand spun. This is the leftover yarn from my weekender. And I have some very early hand spun. In fact, this is spindle spun Polworth. This is very early, not quite usable, very thick and thin. This is the first yarn I spun on my wheel. This is Blue Faced Leicester. I really like the color, but it's very, very inconsistent. So I probably will never knit with it, but I will keep it always. This is actually this is also among my first hand spun. It's overspun. It feels a little ropey, but it's actually way more consistent and really pretty. It's Corriedale, and I actually really love this fiber, so I might get more of it and spin it correctly. And then this is actually the Bamboo Merino, but obviously lots of room to grow in this top left cube. Let's talk rules, or guidelines as it were, for how I am thinking about how to keep my stash the right size for me and how to keep it organized. But before we get into those guidelines, let's go over a few assumptions, shall we? First of all, the Rowan Kid Silk Haze Bonanza that I described in my last episode, and the link for that is in the description below. The lovely 81 shades I won from the Vogue Knitting Live selfie competition. All of that yarn is, of course, part of my stash, but for the purpose of the rules that I'm talking about here, I'm considering it outside my stash. It does all live together in a box, someplace in this room. It's going to have a permanent home, hopefully on display, but it's not part of today's conversation. Second, you should know that I am not a particularly neat person. I I understand the purpose of structure and organization and do use it when it serves a purpose, but I don't love it for its own sake. And part of what I'm thinking about is how to create rules and guidelines that are helpful, yet sort of not too restrictive or detail oriented, such that I just end up ignoring them and things end up becoming messy anyway. And lastly, while hand spun, which is over here, it definitely counts as part of my stash, I'm not too worried about organizing it for now. I've got plenty of room for it, and I'm also not that fast of a spinner. I'm not accumulating my hand spun yarn so quickly that I have to worry about it. I do want to keep knitting with it. It's just that I'm not too worried about that becoming unmanageable. And for now, I'm not going to be buying so much fiber that I am worrying about where I'm going to put it. Perhaps in a future episode, we will talk about spinning fiber acquisition more in detail, but suffice it to say, it's not something I'm all that worried about for now. Those three assumptions aside, let's start talking guidelines. Guideline number one: all yarn and fiber within my stash must fit into the shelving unit, and it is not allowed to exceed this space. Now, I've got a fair amount of room still left in here, and I am not by any means setting a goal with, like, let's fill it up. I know that as yarn stashes go, that mine is not very big. Uh, but I think it's big for me. It's about as much yarn as I feel comfortable having on hand. You know, from what I've seen on YouTube, there are people who have whole walls of yarn stashes. They're almost like a yarn store in their own home. That is awesome for them. I do not cast shade on anyone and their yarn accumulation practices. If it makes them happy, that's great. I just don't want to have so much yarn that I know that it's sable. You may be familiar with the acronym SABLE, Stash Acquisition Beyond Life Expectancy, and I don't want to get anywhere close to that. Rule number two: all yarn must be tracked on Ravelry. Because my skeins in this unit are, I don't have them organized by weight specifically, or, all baggied together and highly structured. I'm going to rely on Ravelry to help me know how much yarn I have, of what kind and what type, and how much yardage I have on each. So any new acquisition of yarn that comes into the stash will be recorded and logged into Ravelry. I find that useful in so many ways. So first, while I'm looking on Ravelry at patterns for inspiration, for what things I might like to knit, I always love to see when, you know, on that details page, it shows that I have in stash yarn that will likely go with the pattern. I also love being able to look at my yarns in stash on Ravelry and then have suggestions for pattern ideas. It's really super useful. I don't yet trade my yarn or sell my yarn on Ravelry, although I am considering doing that in the future. Number 3, I must have a shopping list in hand before going to any fiber festivals. You know, fiber festival is like having 100 yarn stores all in one spot. And it's really easy to walk through the booths and be like, oh, that's inspiring. Oh, that's pretty. I mean, it's the yarn lust, the yarn fumes are the siren song of all that yarn. It's really hard to deny. So I have found for me that when I have a shopping list, such as, patterns I have in mind, it will help me focus such that I just am not buying random skeins of yarn that just looks pretty and I don't really have a purpose for. Not that there's anything wrong with that necessarily, but I think that just helps give me focus and maybe will help with the effects of, okay, let's just say it. I don't want to be spending so much on yarn at fiber festivals that I come home regretting that I've been. I mean, so for example, at the Shenandoah Fiber Festival, let's see here, I bought this lovely shade of hand dyed, naturally dyed fingering from Yarn Over Floyd. It, it is super beautiful and I really like it, and I'm sure I will make socks with it at some point, but I can't tell you how many pink skeins of yarn I've bought just because they're pink. So it was a spur of the moment impulsive purchase. I don't regret it, but was it a important addition to my stash? No, no, it kind of wasn't. On the other hand, when I went to Vogue Knitting Festival this past February, I knew that I wanted to buy yarn for my husband's sweater. So I bought a sweater's quantity of worsted weight Hudson and West forage in blue because I had specifically written down that that was what I was looking for. So I feel more like I went on the hunt and I got what I was looking for. That's kind of more of the feeling I want to have when I'm coming home from a fiber festival. Inspired yet satisfied, if you understand what I mean. Guideline number 4. For yarn bought as a travel souvenir, I need to make sure that the quantity of yarn that I bought matches utility. So let me unpack that a little bit. As those of you who have been watching my channel, I really love to travel. And part of the Yarn Journeys name comes from the fact that I love to take journeys and I love to buy yarn when I'm traveling, both to see what's going on in other countries and parts of the world with yarn and so forth, but also as as a souvenir, as something that reminds me of an amazing trip. But I have found that sometimes those impulsive purchases that I make in yarn shops in other parts of the world or other parts of the country aren't always the best choices for projects later. For example, a let's talk about this lovely sparkly skein of sock yarn I got from Mad About You on Vancouver Island. It reminds me of the fall colors that were on display during that trip. This is like the perfect travel memento. A skein of sock yarn can always be made into socks. So I know that this is going to be useful, and I didn't need to get more than one skein. Great travel souvenir. Let's talk about a purchase decision that perhaps wasn't as successful. So, when I was in Ireland at a yarn shop in Bantry, I bought these two skeins of Life in the Long Grass Highland DK. Beautifully hand dyed yarn in, my favorite colorways of pink and browny red. I do love this yarn, but I keep passing it over as something to knit with because in truth, this is sweater yarn. It's beautiful yarn, but it's begging to be knit into a sweater. And I am, not planning a trip to Ireland anytime soon. It's hand dyed, so dye lot matters a lot. I mean, dye lot always matters. So if I wanted to make a larger sweater out of this yarn specifically, it's been a year later. It's unlikely that I'm going to be able to purchase several more skeins of either of these colors. Now, I could make this into a hat. I could make it into a cowl. This isn't to say I'm never going to use this yarn because I probably will. It's just that because this is more, this yarn is saying to me sweater, I am not, I just keep forgetting that I have it. That doesn't make me feel good about having this in my yarn stash. On the other hand, when I was in Ireland, I bought this beautiful Donegal Spinning Company yarn from Studio Donegal. This said to me, sweater yarn, so I bought a sweater's quantity of it so that at some point in what I hope is the near future, I will be making a lovely sweater with this beautiful yarn that I got in Ireland. For now, it's a lovely reminder of my trip to Ireland, but it also has the promise of a future knitting experience within it. Finally, rule number 5. Having the right yarn for a project is more important than using up stash. Let me explain that a little further. If I am inspired to make a certain sweater or shawl or something, and the my stash doesn't have the required yarn or yarn that could be used for that project, it is perfectly fine to go out and buy the right yarn for that project. I'd rather do that than try to force existing yarn stash into something that it's not right for. And I learned that through experience. So I mentioned in the video when I was walking you through the organization of my stash that I had a sweater's quantity of refurbished yarn. This is an Italian yarn called Zara. I actually have a couple skeins here of that I actually never got to. This is Filatura di Crosa Zara Melange. It's 100% superwash merino. It is beautiful yarn. I originally got it to knit a pattern specifically designed for this yarn. I bought it in a yarn shop. I saw the pattern in a yarn shop. I never finished it. I actually really didn't like the sweater that much, but I really liked the yarn. I ripped out the yarn, balled it back up. Flash forward a couple years, I wanted to knit something again. I really wasn't knitting as frequently as I am now. And I wanted to knit a shawl, and I wanted to use stash. I was trying to be very good about not spending on things that I didn't need. You know, we all go through times when, we're mindful of where we're putting our money. And so I had decided I wasn't going to be buying any new yarn. So I tried to use this yarn for a shawl. Well, this yarn is really round. It is squishy. Its best use is really for projects where you need great stitch definition. It's good for cables. Not so much for a lace shawl. And it ended up being smaller. It didn't have the right dimensions once I knitted it up because I didn't really think about gauge. And I never wore the shawl because it was kind of too small. Didn't have that drapey look that I was going for because the yarn was wrong. I am now on the hunt for a lovely sweater where I intend to use this gorgeous Italian yarn for something more suited for the way it knits up. By the way, the other yarn I refurbished, this is some lovely discontinued Rowan yarn. It's called Cork, and it's got an interesting chainette construction. This kind of yarn, it's also great for experimenting with. So I'm really glad that I have this yarn in my stash, but I'm not going to just use it so I can say I used my stash. So those are my 5 rules slash guidelines for my stash. What do you think? Do you have stash rules? Do you think this is useful? What am I not thinking about? Who knows? Maybe a year from now, I'll be like, stash guidelines. Ha ha. I hope not. I think it's always good to be thoughtful, particularly when you are making purchases. But you do you. I mean, if you love having a big wall of yarn, that is awesome. I am so glad for whatever your stash inclinations are. And in truth, I just love looking at my yarn. It just gives me pleasure to know it's there. So it fulfills its purpose, just being lovely in its squares. And frankly, doesn't it look so much better in this thing than it does in bags willy-nilly all over the floor? And now it's time for show and tell. So I have a finished object for you. I finished my brioche hat. This is the Helix hat by Jonatan Tallow. And I am so happy with how it came out. And yes, I can say I can knit brioche now. Yay! The yarn is Les DK by Julie Asselin. And let's see. I'm really happy with how it fits. It covers my ears, it's squishy, it feels like it's going to be warm, and I think the pattern is just gorgeous. So this is a free pattern on Ravelry. I highly recommend it. Very easy to follow and had helpful instructions. So if you are looking for an easy brioche hat, this is a good one. So the major work in progress I've got going on right now is this one. This is the Gib II sweater for Andrea Mowry that I am making for my husband. As you can see, I've made a lot of progress since my last episode. I am very shortly going to be doing the bottom ribbing on the body. So I had him try it on a couple days ago, and I can report that the shoulders and the yoke fit perfectly. The neck looks like it's sitting right, so that makes me very happy. The the body is a little has a little less positive ease, shall we say, than I think the finished product will. Because I know from washing and blocking my swatch, there'll be more positive ease than there is in the unblocked sweater. So this is why it's important to wash and block your swatch. And to do the swatch so that you know that even though what you're knitting doesn't have the exact dimensions that you're going for, you can feel confident that the finished and blocked sweater will fit. So I am feeling confident that this is going exactly how I want it to. And can we just say, isn't that texture beautiful? I am so pleased with how it's going, and I am loving working with this Hudson and West forage. So very satisfied with the yarn choice on that one. So another thing that I'm working on is something I haven't yet talked about on this channel. I have become curious to take on the Knitting Guild Association's Master Hand Knitter program. So a couple people I follow on YouTube have done the Master Hand Knitting program, and I have become curious about doing it myself. But I also know that it is a big undertaking. And at first, when I looked into it, I was like, wow, that is a lot of fussiness. You know, you have to have your swatches blocked just right. It's a lot of, this is the right way to do things, this is the wrong way to do things. And I was like, it's kind of interesting, but I don't know if that really suits my personality. Yeah, I kept having a bee in my bonnet about it. There's something about this program that attracts me, and it's probably because, you know, it requires a lot of research and figuring stuff out for yourself. So I've dipped my toe in the water on that, and I've started their correspondence course called Basics, 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 which kind of is like the master hand knitting certification process, in which you're being asked to demonstrate through sending in swatches and getting feedback that you know how to do certain skills. But it's much less of an undertaking, and so I'm doing this to see if I enjoy working this way. So I have knit about 2.5 of the swatches required, and here's one. So this is one in which I'm showing that I can knit 2x2 ribbing and garter stitch, as well as do even increases. So I'll be working on this the next few months and seeing whether I enjoy it. And so far, I kind of am, because I am learning more than I thought I would. I mean, at this point in my knitting, I can do ribbing and increases in my sleep. Well, not my sleep, but you know what I mean. And I'm actually being asked to think a little bit more about them, and I am surprised by how much I'm enjoying it. Curious, have you thought about doing the master hand knitter certification through the Knitting Guild Association? If so, why? Have you tried it? Curious to hear what you think. Anywho, we'll see how it goes, and stay tuned so that you can find out about how it's going for me. That's all I've got for you today on this episode of Yarn Journeys. If you enjoyed what you saw today, please do hit that like button. The likes really do help people like yourself who might enjoy the channel find it. So I'm very appreciative of every like I get. And similarly, please do subscribe, because I don't want you to miss the next episode of Yarn Journeys. Thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.